Greetings, comrades. My name is Gigantals, and welcome to an episode of Gigantals Theory. So as you can see from this title of this video, you're probably wondering, wait, what do you mean? You may be confused, especially if you watched my last video about the concept of are we gods or not. You may want to watch that before you watch this. But don't worry, I'll explain everything now. So the point of this video, it's an interesting concept that I found out a little while ago. It's the idea, as you can see in the title, God versus gods. And it's not exactly as this first sounds. For those of you who watched my last video, 9.D fights us, okay, you'll see what I mean now. So throughout the Old Testament, one thing we can see is that Israel had a very, very long history of not following God. You know, to turning to paganism, doing not being very smart in its choices, you know, and in general just causing trouble for themselves because by putting their faith in something that wasn't God, well, they got invaded multiple times. But several times, and I'll look at them in detail later on in the video, we see that God almost seems to actually strike back against these ideologies. So it doesn't matter what God the Israelites are worshipping, he usually goes and ends up correcting them, and he does it in very spectacular ways. Or he teaches other nations lessons, which we all know about through the Bible and because it's been drilled into us since we were children. 10 plagues. So although in the last video I talked about how since we are called to be children of God and be partakers of the divine nature by doing his will on earth, through love and all that, in this video I'll be focusing on the pagan concept of gods and goddesses, okay? So not us, for those who are trying to follow, trying to do God's will on earth, okay? So don't worry, you're safe. I'm talking about the pagans here. So if we use that same reasoning that gods could also mean humans are trying to, similar to how we Christians are meant to be called gods by doing God's will on earth, you know, partaking in divine nature. It could be said that for the pagans, their gods could also be like priests and magicians and all that who are trying to claim the same thing, saying, oh yeah, well, we're taking part in the divine nature here too on earth, but for their pagan deities. God is very, very clever with how he fights these pagan deities, because as you will see later on, God is omnipotent, right? He's the only God and he's omnipotent. And he does a very good job of making those pagan gods' powers or abilities, whatever, backfire. And that's very important for undermining them. Now, the first thing I need to do is just identify just who is God in the Bible and who are the pagan gods, because there's a lot of confusion over over names. Like, God is given a huge amount of names in the Old Testament, and similar as to how in here, if I talk about God, you know I'm talking about the Christian God, and then if you're in the Middle East and you talk about God, people think you're talking about Allah or something. People get very confused. So we basically need to define exactly where they're talking about the Jewish God, okay, and then the pagan gods. So in the Old Testament, God used a lot of multiple names. The most common one was Yahweh, or YHWH, which is a bit hard to pronounce, so they added in a bunch of vowels. Technically his name is El there, E-L, and then they add a bunch of other letters after that. So you get Eloha, Elohai, and then the second common name is Elohim. But the point about this is that El is meant to be the word God. So when you have stuff talking about like Elohim or Elohai, it's meant to be God of, and whether it be like mercy, love, or whatever. The whole point here is that El is God, the root word of it. Now the other 35 deities or so mentioned in the Bible, especially after you distinguish the Hebrew names from the other Semitic names for God, or their versions of him, and the foreign gods. Okay, some of these are only mentioned by name. For instance, there's Molech, which the Ammonites worshipped, and he's well known for the child sacrifices, and Leviticus 22:5 forbids worship of him. Then there's the Queen of Heaven, which is the idol worship of various goddesses, but most particularly Ishtar, which is mentioned in Jeremiah 7:18, 4:17 to 19 and 25. There's Chemosh from the Moabites, which oddly enough was one of the temples built by Sir Solomon for his wives, which is mentioned in 1 Kings 11:7. And then in the New Testament, there were names like Zeus and Mercury, which the disciples were accidentally called in Acts 14:12, and then Diana/Artemis. There was a silversmith making statues about that goddess in Acts 19. 24 to 35, which is Horide. But the interesting ones are where God actually engages with these. So he engaged almost like in combat. And that's the cool stuff. Let's be honest. Just the thought of, you know, gods fighting like almost like in Smite, but it's not Smite because those gods die. And one of these gods definitely doesn't die. We could go into a whole theological debate here about Jesus, but here we're going to be talking about God is in God the Father, because God the Father does all this stuff here. So we're doing the minor ones first. So the first pagan god that God battled was the golden calf. Now the golden calf is mentioned in Exodus 32, whole big chapter, which is probably based on Hathor or Apis, the cow goddess and the bull god. And so what happened was when they started worshiping this god, while Moses was up in the mountain, God said, "Okay, Moses, these people have betrayed me. I will destroy them. You leave here. I'll make you into a great nation." And it said that Moses fell on his feet and fell on his face and said, "No, please don't kill them. Please don't. You know, you promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that you would bring, you know, their descendants to be fruitful. Please don't kill all these people." Which was good. It was good. You know, Moses was a very good man. And so then God spared the destruction of Israel. Although 3,000 supporters of the golden calf were killed by the Levites. Because the Levites were the only tribe that didn't worship the golden calf, and so they were sent to be the judges, and they eventually, because they remained pure from pagan worship, they would become the tribe of priests of God. The rest of the Israelites were punished because through taking the golden calf, grinding it into a powder, and putting it in their water source, and they had to drink it. And it was very bitter, and it basically made them sick. But they were forced to drink it as their punishment. And whilst that may sound a bit strict, remember that they were almost destroyed. I mean, they weren't actually going to be destroyed. God said he was going to destroy them. And then Moses interceded. But the thing was, God wanted Moses to intercede to prove to Moses himself that, you know, he cared for the people, and he also wanted people to read about it later, that Moses was a good man who, even after everything that had happened, you know, he still cared about the Israelites. He still wanted mercy on them, even for their actions. All about forgiveness here. Now, later on, King Jeroboam of northern Israel, after the civil war, the rebellion, the country was divided, built a pair of golden calves at Bethel and Dan to stop the Israelites going to Jerusalem to worship God, because Jerusalem was in southern Israel, you know, in that area, and they didn't want them to have any form of allegiance to the southern country. Then the prophet came along and declared it to be blasphemous, these altars. Yeah, and so he basically called out and insulted those golden calves, and basically called for their destruction. And then God split the two calves in half, and then all the ashes from the offering spilled onto the floor, basically desecrating it. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to stop the Israelites from being able to destroyed by their enemies, because they did continue to worship pagans. The next god to face judgment, you could say, in this list is Dagon. Everyone remembers that he was worshipped in Babylon. Now, the Philistines, who had adopted Dagon from the Phoenicians, I believe it was. And just a quick recap. Basically, previously in battle, the Israelites had taken the Ark of the Covenant to them to fight, and then that was meant to give them strength, and the Israelites defeated the enemies. And so later on, when they fought with the Philistines, the Israelites inappropriately brought the Ark, saying, "Okay, this worked for us. Let's do this now." And so he took it into battle with them and they fought. However, the Philistines captured the Ark and they all scattered. The thing was, the Philistines knew how dangerous the Ark was, because they had heard about what happened in Egypt, and I'll go into that later. They were afraid, which is why when they went to war, they said, "Go straight for the Ark. Don't fight, go straight for the Ark." Because they knew if they could get the Ark, the Israelites would scatter, and they did. And in order to show the dominance of their god Dagon over the God of Israel, they took the Ark of the Covenant and put it before Dagon in his temple. But when they came back the next day, the statue of Dagon was lying on its face before the Ark. It was a big statue, okay? And so they corrected it and left. The next day, they came back, and Dagon was on the floor again, except his head and the palms and his hands had been severed from his body, lying on the floor in front of the Ark. Philistines were terrified. They didn't want to enter the temple again. They decided to move the Ark somewhere else. The problem was, God sent a plague of hemorrhoids, yes, hemorrhoids, onto that city. So they moved the Ark somewhere else, and then that city got a plague of hemorrhoids. So it didn't matter wherever they moved the Ark of the Covenant, they kept getting plagues of hemorrhoids. And so after a while, they eventually just gave the Ark back to the Israelites, saying, "Look, we're running out of toilet paper, just please take this back." Now the next god on this list that faced judgment was Baal, which was brought by Jezebel from Phoenicia. Now, just to clarify, that the problem with the word Baal is that it's similar to how God is here. When we talk about God now, we talk about the Christian God. When we talk about El, when they took the El back then, they referred to the Semitic god. Baal was meant to be their word for God, and also for their god that they worship, the idol. So, which is why sometimes when people look through these ancient Semitic texts, they refer to the people worshipping Baal, and it's not necessarily talking about the idol. It could be also be talking about the Israelite god, not necessarily the idol. It's just a problem with languages here. The language barrier is a big problem. Baal proved to be a very big problem for Israel for a very, very long time, especially in the reign of King Ahab and King Ahaziah and Joram. Now, Elijah, the prophet, is best known for fighting Baal and destroying his influence over the Israelites, including causing a massive drought in Israel throughout the reign of King Ahab. Basically, no rain will fall on this land unless I say so, you Baal worshippers. And that was important, Israel's relation. Now, the big moment was when Elijah went to the king and said, okay, let's see which god is better, Baal or the god of Israel, the one who brought us out of Egypt and some other titles. Okay, let's go to Mount Carmel. Okay, we'll each have a bull, and we will sacrifice a bull to our gods to see who answers. And this is important because Mount Carmel is meant to be the sacred mountain to Baal, so they went there. So Elijah went along with 460 prophets of Baal and 450 prophets of Asherah, which was another god that Jezebel brought into Israel, but they went along probably to support them because they didn't like the God of Israel very much. And then there was a crowd of onlookers to see what was going to happen, because this was important. This was going to be a big battle. So the challenge was to build an altar and to sacrifice a bull to the god that they served. And the god to respond in fire was meant to be the true God. So the 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah sacrificed the bull, and then they sang and danced around the altar, trying to get the attention of their god. And this happened from like morn till afternoon. Like, it was absolutely nuts. And yet no one responded. And then Elijah ridiculed them, basically saying, well, maybe Baal can't hear you because he's far away, or he's traveling somewhere, or he's asleep. And so they went nuts, and then they started basically, they went into a frenzy, and they're like cutting themselves, trying to add their blood, trying to get their God's attention, which the laws given to them by Moses clearly state you should not add human blood to sacrifices. And they continued all the way into the evening until finally they collapsed from exhaustion. Then it was Elijah's turn. So Elijah built an altar from the 12 stones, which represented the tribes of Israel. He sacrificed the bull and laid the pieces of the bull on top of the altar. And then he completely soaked everything around on the altar in water, and he dug a trench around the altar and then filled that with water too. And then he called upon God to prove to the Israelites just his power and that he's real and that Baal isn't. And then apparently from an empty sky, fire came down and consumed all the bull, all the stones, the wood, and all the water in the area. So it's just leaving it bone dry. And then the crowd watching all this, then stoned all the prophets of Asherah and Baal for lying to them, and they also turned, I believe, the main altar, wherever it was, into a toilet to continuously desecrate it. And Elijah prayed, and then it finally started to rain in Israel again. And since that day, Israel, although it had returned to pagan worship a little bit later, it never worshipped Baal to that same degree. I mean, Elijah was a very, very important prophet. I mean, he appeared in the Transfiguration with Christ and Moses, relating back to God being very clear with how he fights. Baal was meant to be their storm weather deity. So asking Baal to answer by fire or lightning should have been very easy for that god to do. But because he didn't, yet God could do what Baal couldn't do, even though he should have been able to do that, was God completely undermining Baal in his own power. And that's the whole point here. God it's a bit more than fighting a statue when it comes to pagan worship. It's also about undermining the entire ideology behind that idol, fighting what people believe that idol is to be. And that's exactly what God did. He used exactly what Baal should have done when he didn't, because obviously he doesn't exist, and that completely destroyed the people's faith in Baal and they ended up studying those prophets. This kind of battle isn't only limited to the Bible. Saint Boniface went to convert the Germanic tribes, and one of the things that he ended up facing a lot of persecution in Germany, in the Germanic area, because people talk about, you're God of Boniface, you can't defeat Thor, our thunder god. Yes, Thor. And so what ended up happening was that by this oak tree sacred to Thor, the pagans there were about to do a child sacrifice. Saint Boniface interrupted. Okay, and depending on the story, on which interpretation you read of it, Saint Boniface stuck out his crook caught the axe, which then shattered on his crook. And then he grabbed an axe and then basically insulted Thor, and he started chopping down the sacred oak to Thor, and then the oak fell over, and all the pagans are like, "Where's Thor? Why is he not punishing him?" And then again, it also varies here a little bit. There's either a fir tree grew out of the stump of that oak, or Saint Boniface told them to come join him and pointed to a fir tree nearby and said that fir tree is now a Christian symbol, and that it should be taken into everyone's homes to remind them of Christ. It was through this way that the Germanic tribes were converted from paganism to Christianity. And this is very important because I'll go about it later on in the year when we do my Christmas video. But that fir tree would become the Christmas tree, and that's why Christmas trees originated in Germany. It's because of Saint Boniface. Obviously, Christmas trees aren't pagan. They started as a direct insult against Thor, and it's still here to this day. But going back to the Bible, okay, let's just go back to the Bible. And here's the big one. We're doing the 10 plagues now. Now, the precursor to the 10 plagues, okay, was, as we all know, the staff turning into a snake. But it's a bit, even though I binge watched the Prince of Egypt, they got it a bit wrong then. It was Aaron who put his staff on the floor, and then that turned into a snake. And then the magicians made 2 snakes using their magic arts, and Aaron's snake still ate both of theirs and then turned back into a staff. This evidently showed that was important because those 2 snakes were meant to symbolize Upper and Lower Egypt. Yeah, something like how the Pharaoh's crown consists of 2. There's the white one and then the red one, one within the other, and that's meant to be Upper and Lower Egypt. And basically, the snake eating was meant to show God's dominance, his power over the Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, the point of the 10 plagues was 1, to deliver the Israelites from slavery and to take them to the Promised Land. 2, so that the Israelites may know the power of God. 3, to show God owned everything and created everything, not the pagan gods that were worshipped in the land. 4, to answer Pharaoh's question of who was the God of Israel that Moses said he must obey. And 5, to judge the Egyptian gods. And the way it's similar to what he did with Baal, it's very clever. So the first plague was just to turn the Nile to blood. Now, the Nile, the Egyptians worshipped as the source of life. Because sustenance came from the annual floods of the Nile and everything. And the turning the Nile to blood would clash with Khnum, which is meant to be the guide of the Nile. Hapi, which is meant to be the spirit of the Nile and god of fertility, and Osiris, who was meant to be the god of the underworld, and apparently the Nile was his blood. This killed the fish in the Nile, which were meant to have been protected by Hathor, which is the goddess of the sky, who got a woman and fertility and love. As you may remember, Hathor was also the cow goddess I mentioned before. And there was also an attack on Neith, who was meant to be one of the goddesses of war, weaving, meant to be created like this, the first bread of life or something, and then like knitted together fate or whatever. And she was also apparently meant to be the creator goddess, that from everything came forth, yet this directly insulted her. This not only damaged the reputation of 5 gods and goddesses, but it also showed that the sustenance of the world relies on God, not the gods of Egypt. Now the magicians could mimic this, but they couldn't turn it back, and he stayed like blood for several days. The second plague was frogs, many frogs. And this was an attack on Hekwet, who was the goddess of good crops and the Nile waters and childbirth, and Isis, the fertility goddess. The frogs were sacred to the Egyptians, but their goddesses were powerless to stop these frogs as they went everywhere and they spoiled all the food and drink and died and rotted, horrible smell in the streets, polluting everything. And so these 2 goddesses were completely undermined. The magicians could also mimic the frogs with their magic arts, but they couldn't reverse it. And the third plague was lice from the dust of the earth. And this attacked every single deity of the earth. So Akor, the Tatenen, Geb, all those. And the magicians had to admit defeat here because they couldn't mimic this. and they admitted that there was a power higher than them that was causing all this. So up to that point, from this point on, the magicians could only watch in helpless horror as they saw all this happening. Now, the fourth plague was an attack, which were the flies, was an attack on Khepri, who was the morning aspect of Ra, and he was meant to show cleanliness by burying the dung, or rolling the sun across the skies, the morning aspect of Ra, as I said before. And so this is really important. This is the first attack against the sun gods. Again, completely undermined. The fifth plague was the death to most of the livestock in Egypt. And as obviously livestock is a source of food, milk, transportation and clothing and everything, but that's all gone now. There was an attack on Apis, the sacred bull god, Hathor, she's typically, again, Hathor again, she's usually shown as a cow, so she's seen as a cow goddess. Nevis, I believe you pronounce it, which is the bull god of fertility, and Isis, who was typically shown wearing cow horns. More gods and goddesses hit here, completely undermined. The sixth plague was boils, and this was an attack on all the gods of healing and magic, such as Hike, who would be also known as Heka, and for the Greeks are known as Hecate, the goddess of magic. So this is an attack on Hike, the god of magic, and Thoth, the god of knowledge. This clearly showed their lack of power in all this, and it also showed that nothing can hide from God. Right? All the healing and stuff comes from him. The seventh plague was a massive hailstorm and the apparent lightning that followed. Depending on how you read it, the hail came down and burned like fire on the ground. But whatever it was, there was a big hailstorm and fire was involved. And this was an attack on Shu, who was the god of air, Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, and Nut, the goddess of the sky. So this is an attack on the sky deities. And this proved that they do not control the weather. The eighth plague were the locusts, and this is an attack on the agricultural deities like Geb and Seth. And this also again completely undermined the fact that sustenance does not come from gods but from God. Now the ninth plague again was very important. It was an attack on Ra, the sun god, and he was meant to be the king of all the gods. It also did undermine Horus, who's apparently his left eye was meant to be the sun and his right eye was meant to be the moon. If you think about it, how does that make sense? You have would Khepri roll Horus's eye across the sky? That makes no sense. The point was it undermined Horus and Khepri again. So, the king of the gods himself, Ra, completely undermined. Evidently God is the light of the world. Jesus is emphasized as light of the world here. Definitely not the pagan gods. And the 10th plague was the death to all the firstborn and cattle males. So all the firstborn boys. So I would be dead. And this was an attack on Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh is meant to be the incarnation of Ra and Osiris. His whole point of existence is that he's meant to uphold favor with the gods and keep everyone in line with the laws of Ma'at, which is meant to be the goddess of order in opposition to Apophis or Apep, who was a god of chaos. Yet he was completely powerless to prevent the death of every single firstborn in Egypt, including his own son. And this showed that God controls life and death. No man nor God, apart from him, can do that. And this ended up massively messing up the political system and is believed to have ended up causing the anarchy at the end of the Old Kingdom or whatever kingdom it was. There was a lot of anarchy caused, and then there was the fact that they lost a huge amount of their army since it was drowned in the Red Sea. It was the way I like to think of this. Imagine like this. Egypt basically collapses from the pain and the weakness, and it takes a very long time to recover from that. In the book of Job, when they reference how God is the only one who can defeat the Leviathan, you can take that several ways. One, that there's an actual Leviathan out there. Two, that's also been interpreted as Leviathan is meant to be Egypt, and only God can defeat the Leviathan. And this is also meant to show, you could say here that God is the only one who can defeat Egypt. And he did it in such a way that it completely undermined Egypt, because Egypt at that point in time was Israel's most dangerous enemy. And they could have really messed around with Israel for several years, even after they had go back to the Promised Land. But because God inflicted those plagues on Egypt, it completely weakened Egypt. It, as I remember clearly from the Prince of Egypt, I will smite Egypt with all of my wonders. And that's exactly what happened. Egypt was crippled, and it was basically silent for a very long time. because they did not want to go and anger the God of the Hebrews again. Now that is basically that concept of God versus gods, through whether it be through in the Bible or in tradition. Now one thing to almost like look forward to with almost like grim anticipation, because not like it's going to be all sunshine and rainbows and everything when it happens, but we're in the Revelation, which is basically God who finally banishes Satan and evil and everything to that lake of fire at the end of it. You can imagine how intense things are going to get when the army of heaven comes down to chain up the dragon, and then the final battle in which the Satan is finally cast down into hell along with everyone who joins with him. You can imagine how, again, in like a grim anticipation, you're going to suffer heavily before that, but you can imagine how cool it would be to watch all that. And again, I need to emphasize here that when God fights gods, it's more than fighting an idol. It's also fighting an ideology, the ideology of paganism, and putting faith in idols. You can send as many missionaries as you want, but if people have that much faith in their gods, it's not going to work. Which is why you need to completely undermine their faith in those pagan idols. If there's one thing that Bible emphasizes, is that I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. And if you doubt that, well, again, there's the 10 plagues, there's the complete destruction of Baal, there's St. Boniface. Now, in another video, I'll be talking about whether or not the 10 plagues could have actually happened, or whether they could be explained by science, or whether they were miracles. But that's for another video. So that's the end of this video, God versus gods. If you like this video, please give a like, please share my videos, please do comment what you think of them and the video you want me to do. Please subscribe to my channel so you can see more of this content. Please ring bells to keep up with my video releases. Next episode, I'll do some other theory video, maybe about the 10 plagues. That's for another video. So see you next video, comrades. Until then.